Out on the edge of town sat a sprawling piece of land that had been in David's family for generations. A ranch, quiet and peaceful, filled with old oak trees, rolling fields, and a small lake that had always been a sanctuary. It was not just property, it was heritage. His grandfather had worked the soil, his father had raised cattle, and now David used it as both a home and a place to escape from the chaos of modern life. To him, it was private, sacred ground, but to the newly formed Homeowners Association in the neighboring development, it was something else entirely. When the subdivision had been built just down the road, David hadn't thought much of it. Rows of identical homes, perfectly manicured lawns, and freshly painted fences had popped up almost overnight. The HOA had been established to enforce rules about mailboxes, landscaping, and the exact shade of beige homeowners were allowed to paint their houses. None of that had anything to do with him. He didn't live in their neighborhood, didn't sign any covenants, and certainly never paid their dues. In his mind, their rules ended where his fence line began. But the HOA board didn't see it that way. It started subtly. A few families from the development would walk down his private dirt road, claiming they were just exploring. Kids wandered onto his property to fish in the lake, sometimes leaving soda cans and plastic bag behind. He thought it was rude, but not unusual. People had always tested boundaries with wide-open land. Then came the newsletter. One of his friends who lived in the subdivision slipped him a copy. Right there, in black and white, the HOA board had announced that a new community recreation area was being developed, complete with a pool, clubhouse, and lake access. David froze as he read the words. The so-called community area they described wasn't in their neighborhood. It was on his ranch. His private lake was being advertised as if it were public property. At first, David thought it was some kind of clerical mistake. Surely they hadn't just claimed his land as their own. But within weeks, trucks started showing up. Construction crews unloaded equipment at the far edge of his property, near the line where his fence had long ago fallen into disrepair. Without asking, without permission, they started digging. Bulldozers tore into ground, ripping up grass and flattening soil. Piles of lumber and concrete blocks were delivered. And right there, where his cattle once grazed, a massive rectangular hole began to take shape. The HOA was building a pool on his land. David was stunned. Outraged, he tried calling the HOA office, but no one returned his calls. He drove to the development's clubhouse and demanded to speak with the board. They brushed him off, insisting that according to their maps, the land was common property designated for community use. He told them they were mistaken, that his deed went back decades, long before the subdivision ever existed, but they acted as if he were the one trespassing. Soon, flyers went out to every family in the subdivision. Coming soon, the new pool and clubhouse. Excited residents started showing up, eager to see the progress. They parked along his driveway, walked through his fields, and treated his private land like it was already theirs. David tried confronting them, but the HOA had fueled a sense of entitlement. The neighbors insisted it was community property, that their HOA dues were paying for construction, and that he couldn't keep them out. The sense of violation grew worse each day. He would wake up to the sound of nail guns and hammers, echoing across land that was supposed to be a sanctuary. He saw strangers splashing in the lake where he used to fish in silence. He found fast food wrappers floating in the water and beer bottles smashed along the shore. His heritage, the legacy of his family, was being bulldozed and paved over in the name of community recreation. David went to the county office, deed in hand, demanding answers. The clerk confirmed what he already knew. The land was legally his. The property lines were clear. The HOA had no claim to it. But as with many battles against organized boards, the problem wasn't just legal, it was political. The HOA board had convinced dozens of families that the land was theirs, and undoing that belief would not be easy. Word spread quickly that David was causing trouble. The HOA painted him as a greedy landowner who wanted to keep the community from enjoying a shared space. At meetings, they told residents that he was trying to take away their future pool and clubhouse, that he was standing in the way of progress. Soon, neighbors who once waved politely now glared at him with hostility. Cars honked when they passed his gate. Strangers shouted insults as they walked across his property. But David wasn't going to roll over. He had every right to that land, and no HOA was going to steal it from under him. Still, each day the construction continued. The sense of helplessness grew heavier. Watching bulldozers tear into the earth was like watching someone vandalize a piece of his soul. And when he saw the wooden frame of the clubhouse begin to rise against the horizon, it hit him. This wasn't just about trespassing anymore. This was theft in the boldest, most public form. He knew he couldn't fight this battle with words alone. He would need lawyers, county officials, and possibly law enforcement on his side. But one thing was clear. The HOA had started a war. They thought they could take his land, rename it as public property, and get away with it. They had no idea what kind of fight they had picked. And so, as the first walls of the pool clubhouse went up on his ranch, David stood at the edge of the construction site, fists clenched, knowing this was only the beginning of a battle that would test him in ways he never imagined. The day after David watched the wooden frame of the clubhouse rising from his soil, he drove straight to the county courthouse. He wasn't a man of paperwork. He preferred the honest work of sweat and soil. But now, the war wasn't with cattle or crops. It was with paper, signatures, and legal lines that could either protect him or bury him. Inside the courthouse, the smell of dust and old records hung in the air. He waited in line, deed folder tucked under his arm, until finally he was sitting across from a clerk. He spread out every document he had. Maps from the surveyor, property tax receipts, and the original deed, yellowed with age, carrying his grandfather's signature. The clerk scanned everything carefully and then leaned back with a sigh. The answer was clear. The land belonged to David. His family's ranch was not listed anywhere in the subdivision plat. It was separate, untouchable by the HOA's covenants. Relief mixed with fury. If the paperwork was so clear, how could the HOA claim otherwise? That question followed him to the zoning office, where he discovered the truth. Somewhere along the way, the HOA had submitted documents of their own. Poorly drawn maps, misleading descriptions, and vague references to adjacent land parcels had been filed, as though the ranch was part of their community's common area. It wasn't official, it wasn't binding, but it was enough to confuse construction companies, enough to let the HOA spin their story and keep building. This was no accident. This was deliberate. Armed with copies of his deed and survey, David reached out to an attorney. The lawyer flipped through the paperwork, nodding, before delivering the advice David dreaded. This won't be quick. You have the law on your side, but HOA boards thrive on dragging things out. They'll bury you in hearings, claims, and motions if they can. We can stop them, but you need to be ready for a fight. The word fight echoed in his mind. David wasn't afraid of hard battles. But this wasn't just about stubborn neighbors. This was an organized board with money, power, and dozens of families already convinced the land was theirs. Winning wouldn't just mean proving ownership. It meant dismantling the lies the HOA had built. Meanwhile, construction didn't slow. In fact, it sped up. Trucks rumbled down his driveway daily, leaving deep tire ruts in the dirt. By the end of the week, the pool hole was fully framed, plumbing pipes snaking to the ground like veins. The clubhouse walls were being wrapped in plywood. And every evening, David found strangers wandering across his ranch, taking photos of their new amenity. The sense of trespass deepened when he came home one night to find a family barbecuing on his land. They had set up folding chairs on his grass, their children running barefoot to the lake. When he told them this was private property, they looked at him as though he were the trespasser. The HOA said this is for the community. They argued. And no matter how many times he repeated the words, "This is my ranch," the blank disbelief in their eyes showed the damage had already been done. The HOA wasn't just building without permission. They were rewriting reality. Determined not to let them get away with it, David's lawyer filed a cease and desist order. A formal notice was delivered to the HOA board, demanding that all construction stop immediately or face legal consequences. But the HOA board didn't stop. They didn't even flinch. Instead, they rallied. At the next board meeting, they presented David as an obstacle. They told residents he was trying to take away the pool that their dues had funded. They painted him as greedy, out of touch, and unwilling to share resources with the community. Neighbors clapped, cheered, and booed his name, buying into the narrative that the land had been rightfully theirs all along. Soon after, a letter arrived in David's mailbox, addressed from the HOA itself. The board claimed that since the land was undesignated common area, David was legally obligated to cede it for community use. They even threatened to fine him if he interfered with construction. Fines on land he had owned for decades. The arrogance was staggering. His lawyer laughed when he saw the letter, calling it nothing more than intimidation. Legally, the HOA had no authority to fine him. Their covenants only applied to homeowners within their subdivision, and David wasn't one of them. Still, the letter was a glimpse into board strategy. Confuse, intimidate, and push until he gave up. But David wasn't giving up. The next move was his. His lawyer filed for an injunction, demanding that the court put an immediate stop to construction until ownership was settled. If the judge approved, the HOA would be forced to halt everything or risk contempt of court. Yet even as the paperwork wound its way through the system, the HOA kept building. By the second month, the clubhouse had a roof, the pool was being lined, and residents were already signing up for summer memberships as though it were officially theirs. Some even posted on social media, boasting about the new private pool their HOA had built. David scrolled through the posts at night, his jaw tightening with every photo. His ranch, his heritage, was now a backdrop for Facebook albums and neighborhood bragging rights. The place where his father had taught him to ride a horse was being turned into a playground for people who didn't even know his name. And so, the war lines were drawn. On one side stood David, with his deed, his history, and the truth. On the other stood the HOA, with their money, their board meetings, and their ability to sway public opinion. The court date loomed closer, but tension in the neighborhood was already boiling over. Residents confronted him when he drove past. Some accused him of being selfish. Others shouted threats. And late one night, he found the locks on his ranch gate cut, tire tracks leading deep into his fields. It was no longer just about property lines. It was about pride, power, and control. The HOA believed they could bully him into surrender. David believed no one could take what rightfully belonged to his family. But even he knew this was only the beginning, because once the courtroom doors opened, the paper trail of war would reveal everything. In the end, the court ruled firmly in David's favor. The HOA was forced to tear down the pool and clubhouse, repay damages, and issue a public apology. The residents who once mocked him now looked on in silence as bulldozers removed what never should have been built. David stood by the lake, watching his land slowly return to peace. The ranch, scarred but not broken, remained his sanctuary, a reminder that no HOA could rewrite his family's legacy.